Hello and welcome to this month's Rights in Russia interview. It is November 17th, 2023, and today our guest is Ed Rekosh, a U.S. academic and innovative leader in the global human rights community. He's been a member of the adjunct faculty at Columbia Law School for many years and a visiting professor of law at Cardozo Law School and Central European University. In 1997, Ed founded PILnet, the global network for public interest law, with a view to developing global resources and networks in support of local human rights advocacy around the world. He served as president and CEO of PILnet until 2015, received the American Bar Association's International Human Rights Award in 2009, and he was a co-founder of the International Human Rights Watch Film Festival. In 2018, Ed co-founded Rights CoLab, an initiative that aims to advance human rights by encouraging collaboration among experts across the fields of civil society, technology, business, and finance, helping create innovative human rights initiatives in China and in over 30 countries in Europe, Asia, and Africa. Welcome to Rights in Russia, Ed. It is wonderful to see you again.
Great to see you too, Mary.
Moving on to PILnet now, the global network for public interest law that you founded in 1997. It included attention to Russia and several other countries. Could you summarize for our listeners PILnet's general aims and strategic methodology?
Sure. PILnet was an offshoot of a consultancy I did for the Ford Foundation, in essence. And that consultancy was to help a program officer at that time. The relevant program officer at that time was Joseph Schul, and he was responsible for Eastern Europe and Russia in the 90s, early 90s. And the idea of the Ford Foundation's idea was there's something happening in Eastern Europe and Russia. It involves civil society organizations, and it involves law, and good things are happening. But we should think about the longer run. How do we sustain these good things that we're supporting through our grants? What are the strategies we can deploy that will help create sustainable change? And I had just come back from Romania, where I had served for a few years running a project of what became Global Rights, what became the NGO Global Rights, which no longer exists. And so I was coming fresh back from an experience of working on the ground with civil society organizations coming out from nowhere, from people's kitchens, basically. And so I had some thoughts. I had a lot of thoughts about that. And Joe thought that I might be useful in helping to develop this internal strategy process. And we did. And he asked me to write a concept note. How would we explore this? How would we explore public interest law in Eastern Europe and Russia was the question. My suggestion was simply to convene the people, the amazing, remarkable people I'd been meeting in Eastern Europe. I hadn't been to Russia at that point. And that's what we did. So we had a big conference in Oxford, and we had a big conference in South Africa after that, because the Oxford conference was so fruitful. And the strategies that PILnet wound up pursuing were strategies that derived from that process. So it wasn't like I was the founder of PILnet, but it's not like it was my inspired vision of strategies that would save the world. It was really just being a backup support for the strategies that were emanating from this process.
Right. So
that was the methodology.
Yeah.
That was the methodology. With what the strategies wound up becoming, which is probably the question that is in the background, were things like, in an Eastern European context, the situation of Roma was very important. So some strategies having to do with public interest litigation in Roma came up, but more generically, including in Russia, the role of legal education for lawyers. If law was going to be an important instrument for social change, then we should think about how law exists almost sociologically in Russia, and how legal education either hurts or enhances the prospect of using law as an instrument for social change. So clinical legal education came out of that whole process as a priority, building university-based legal clinics, and that had a trajectory in Russia. Legal aid, the very concept of providing legal assistance when someone gets in trouble with the law or wants to pursue their rights through the legal system, that came out of that. So a number of strategies, pro bono, eventually pro bono, which PILnet still very much focuses on, the opportunity of matching up the very abundant legal resources of the private legal sector, the private law firms, with NGO legal advocacy. That came out of that too. So that's the origins of PILnet and its work.
Right. And was there a fellows program associated with PILnet? And could you say a little bit about that?
I mean, what happened was that PILnet was really a spin-off of this process. So I was asked to write a grant proposal because good strategies were happening. I mean, good strategies were being developed within this collective effort. But it wasn't the priority of any of the individuals or organizations involved to pursue those strategies. So Ford wanted some instrument for helping support it. What was not the high priority for anyone was a low priority for everyone. And so PILnet was set up as a spin-off institution to support, to take on the priority of organizing and helping support the strategies. And so I was asked to write the grant proposal and continue the effort because it couldn't be done within Ford Foundation. And I had to look for a host institution. And I wound up going back to my alma mater, Columbia Law School, had a really great conversation with the dean at the time, David Lebron, and the head of the clinical faculty at the time, Barbara Schatz. And we had a meeting of the minds, and then we were at a law school. So this fellows one of the first activities we had was to set up the PILnet Fellows Program. actually at the time it was called the PILI Fellows Program, PILI, Public Interest Law Initiative. We changed our name somewhere along the way. And so it was simply like, we're at a law school, we have amazing resources, how do we capitalize on that most efficiently? And the kind of obvious answer was, well, let's bring individuals within this network, especially the people who could benefit the most. So people that are either starting out or even more importantly, mid-career, they might be recruited by an NGO, ready to take on more responsibility, or maybe they have a vision for creating a new NGO or something, and bring them so they can extract the resources themselves instead of just packaging it and doing workshops and publications and stuff. Just bring them and expose them. That was the concept behind it. And we did that for a very long time, the whole time I was there, from probably year 2 is when we started. Oh. I think we designed it year 1, but we didn't start until year 2, 1998, I guess.
Well, so there must have, many individuals must have benefited from that. I'm sure.
Over 100. Yeah, many. Yeah.
So thinking about PILnet in Russia, or PILI in Russia, in the 1990s and early 2000s, how successful was it?
Well, so Russia was an interesting case for I'll say PILnet because I've gotten used to the new name. Okay. So for PILnet's work, and mainly because of just the origin story of PILnet. My own background was in Eastern Europe. I had been in Romania in the early 90s, had become really engaged with Romanians who were trying to transform their own society and were civil society based. And Russia was a real learning experience for me because it was very different. And although many Russians had been in the same process with the Eastern Europeans, I would say the differences were as important as the similarities. There were some obvious similarities having to do with recent history and legal systems and things like that, but huge differences. And I think those differences had a lot to do with the specific history of Russia, with the size and importance of Russia, with the geopolitical positioning, all of those, and probably other factors too, cultural factors, attitude toward the law. So many things were different that I would say in the early days of engaging with Russia, it was mostly about, most of my experience was about, well, this is really working in Eastern Europe. Why doesn't it work in Russia? It wasn't really, there was no like, there's a lot of humility involved. Like, seems so similar and yet it's so challenging. How do I understand that? Something must be possible to do, but it's going to have to look differently. And I would say I think we ultimately did have a lot of success as an organization in assisting change, but I think a lot of it had to do with just finding the right people, the right Russians to work with. And one of them, I think the most important person for me and for the organization was getting to know a man named Dmitry Shebelnikov, who you may remember, who wound up becoming the director of our Moscow office. And he had been a consultant to Ford Foundation. So I met him through Ford Circles. We did some workshops together, and basically he became, my own approach to it was, okay, what does Dima think? And he would be the translator for me and also the translator for our strategies. We were doing this in Eastern Europe. He became very intimately familiar with achievements we were having in Eastern Europe. And we would talk a lot. We would have a lot of debates and discussions about what would this look like in Russia. Mm-hmm. And often to good effect, often to frustratingly incomplete effect, or up and downs, trying something, it doesn't work, trying again, a lot of that.
Mm-hmm. And how did you, at that time, assess the development of civil society more generally in Russia? I mean, particularly given your Eastern European experience.
Yeah, big differences. So one big difference was the origins of human rights civil society, to just focus on human rights. The origins were incredibly strong and important. Arguably, Russian civil society has had as much effect on Russian human rights civil society had as much effect on U.S. human rights civil society as vice versa, because the origin story of Human Rights Watch had a lot to do with the dissidents who started talking about the OSCE, at the time CSCE, human rights dimension on the streets of Moscow. This was so that Eastern Europe doesn't really have a story like that. We have Václav Havel, we have the Polar story, we have some equally important stories, but the scale is just different in Russia. So the origin story of human rights in Russia is hugely important. That's one thing. Certainly, Romanian backstory for human rights pales in comparison. But then also the scale. So in most Eastern European countries, the human rights movement was very much a capital city-based movement, and that was feasible and effective, could be effective, because they were small countries. And although Moscow dominates Russia culturally and politically in many ways, it's just too big a country for it to be able to, for initiatives starting in the capital city to have unimpeded influence throughout the country. And I think that's one of the real key factors that makes civil society more complicated in Russia. Also, in some ways, more potentially sustainable if you're optimistic, but quite challenging if you're instrumental in your thinking, if you're running projects and have like a strategic vision and things like that, more complicated.
Mm-hmm. And so I'd like to get your view of the human rights organizations that were operating at the time, those in Moscow, the Moscow-Helsinki group and Memorial, but also did you work with the local groups in regional cities and towns in other parts of the country?
Yeah, I think my most direct exposure in that regard was really through the universities, through academic networks, and through many people who were trying to, the buzzword was clinics, develop clinics. And I met some really remarkable people, and coming from lots of different parts of Russia. And yeah, there were amazing things happening, actually, depending on which part of Russia citing, actually. But it was eye-opening for me because I was used to working in smaller countries. Mm-hmm. And so the sheer variety of context and characteristics of the people doing the activism was really interesting and eye-opening. And progress was being made. Progress was it felt definitely like progress. And this, we also, through those academic networks, also meeting some of the NGOs in other places, like Sudyajnik would be an example that comes to mind, or Committee Against Torture, places like that were outside of Moscow and having huge effect. It was really interesting for me.
Did you get the sense that the progress that was being made toward a vibrant civil society was irreversible at that time?
I would have to say no. No, no. I remember feeling very humble in my own predictions about that. I mean, overall, like putting it into perspective, overall, this was the time when people engaged in civil society development or democratization were riding a wave. You know, it felt like there was this inevitability to it globally, like in general. But my experience with Russia was always like, wow, that's much harder here. That was basically what, you know, my outsiders, because of my particular experience and feeling more and more embedded in Eastern Europe and feeling really a part of all those experiences, having that like worldview, and then encountering Russian resistance, cultural, historical, whatever the causes are, but feeling a lot of headwind. I would say I was never, yeah, it was easy to be optimistic in Eastern Europe. It wasn't easy to be optimistic in Russia. So, and then it's always hard to figure out like, well, what was I really thinking in the moment, and how influenced am I by what happened after? But I just remember thinking like, this is complicated. I don't really know what all the answers are, and I'm not sure what we're doing really is important or not. I can't tell. I had that feeling much more in Russia than I did when I was doing my work in Eastern Europe.
Mm-hmm. Thinking then ahead, are there lessons that can be learned there for how foreign funding can or should interact with domestic civil society groups?
Yeah, for sure. And by the way, I'm also influenced by experiences I had after that, because I started to work in China a lot. Eventually, PILnet opened an office in Beijing and in Hong Kong. The office in Hong Kong is still there. And so my lens is also influenced by what happened afterwards. And absolutely, there's some lessons. And key lesson is, well, yeah, in Eastern Europe, it was very easy to think, because of the conditions in the 90s, how things were, it was very easy to think like, oh, we'll just come up with some good ideas and then we're going to help. And they're going to just spread and it'll all be great. And in Eastern Europe, I think a big factor for why, that has had an up and down history too, of course, but in the 90s, it looked like it was just a narrative of progress. And I think the role of Europe as an idea and as a political entity and so on was really instrumental. And that's not true in these other places in the same way. And so I think what the lesson learned really is, think local, or listen, or you know, just have humility, have some humility, and try to like listen to what people who have lived there all their lives think they want to do, and find way, and you know, don't come with your recipes and your solutions. Just find ways to support, or you know, open up a discussion where you hear the genuine question and not the instrumental question, and see if you can help. So I'd say that's the lesson. And then applying that in more practical terms to now, I would say, which I imagine is what's behind the question. I don't, yeah, I don't think there are like simple solutions, but but I don't feel pessimistic either. I feel guarded optimism. I'm an optimistic person by nature anyway, and there's plenty of things for me to be pessimistic about, though, from my own experiences of having worked in China, for example, which is even a more difficult case than Russia these days. But there's cause for optimism, because the way that I look at it, people are people. They haven't disappeared. Human beings develop values, and they tend to retain them over time. It's just who they are. It's in their identity. And they will find ways to exercise those values. And so there are always ways. And the tricky part is like, well, how do we help? We can't help the old way. So what's the new way? And that's then the challenging intellectual and strategic question.
So to what extent do you think civil society in Russia can be blamed for not being able to stop the development of authoritarianism in the country? I mean, I think
not at all. I would say my answer to that is not at all.
Yeah.
And because the forces are much larger than what civil society has the power to control. But it's an interesting question, the way you framed it. Because there's a presumption that it was civil society's responsibility to counteract authoritarianism in the first place. And I think we had a lot of hopes on that. People within Russian civil society and outside both had a lot of hopes that more than hope, it was more like a passionate commitment and vision. Like, we are going to change things. And that's a wonderful human aspiration. But the world is really complicated. And I think I come away from these decades of experience having less reliance, not just intellectually, which I always had, but like through my lived experience, less reliance on a narrative of progress. It's just not so simple. And it doesn't mean that the efforts are not critically important. They are. It's just not so simple.
Do you have any thoughts or ways to explain kind of the more recent events in Russia that culminated in the full-scale invasion of Ukraine? I mean, would you have seen this coming? What?
No, I mean, who saw who? I don't know. Did anyone see it coming? No. I was surprised. I mean, some people say they saw it coming, I guess, especially in the immediate lead up. But I would say even to the day of that invasion, I was surprised. The morning I woke up and found out what was going on, I actually was surprised. I had a different analysis of what was going to happen. So, I don't know. I find that I don't know how that happened. It's rather astonishing. And as I don't really know how, it's fashionable to talk about polycrises. So that's one of several crises the world is experiencing now. And I really don't know how any of it happened, really. I can't wrap that up in a neat little explanation. I'm still processing like we all are.
Right. So your current work with Rights CoLab is focused on reimagining civil society, including looking beyond grant funding for NGOs and exploring new organizational forms and alternative resource models. So thinking about this in the context of Russia, I mean, to what extent is it relevant to Russia today?
Yeah.
Or perhaps in the future?
Yeah, I think it's completely relevant. It has to do with my reason for saying that has to do with the point that I made just a little bit earlier about how in my own belief about human nature and like the sweep of history and stuff like that. There will always be effort. I think there will always be efforts in Russia to counteract authoritarianism and to promote civic engagement and things like that, to use some political science terms. But there will always be trends like that. There will always be efforts like that. And so the question is like, how? And my spiel on this is back in the 90s, you and I and a lot of people we know were all engaged in this efforts to respond to opportunity. Like, the world was changing in a good way, in a way that created opportunities for people who care about human rights. And we all looked for ways to try to accelerate that process or enhance it or support it. And that took the form of finding individuals who were change agents, who were potential agents for change. And what do you need? Let's get it to you. And inevitably, not because this is my own view on this, of course, it's just my own thoughts on it, but we didn't have any, so I'm speaking for everyone, but I'm not really, I'm speaking for myself. I didn't have any real thought through process, like what's the best way to do that. Like, I don't think I had a strategic thinking like, oh, let's help them figure out how to make probably, I'm going to say American style. You could say maybe American or European, but anyway, American style nonprofit organizations, because I think the United States has developed this kind of style of organization more than anywhere else, really. You could say UK style too, I suppose. But anyway, Anglo-Saxon nonprofit organizations, and then so that we can give them grants, and then let's give them grants, and then let's develop them into these US/UK style nonprofits. I don't think anyone sat in a room saying like, this is the best way to make change happen. It just was the easiest way, because all of a sudden there was a lot of funding coming online. They were in foundations that needed to make grants to nonprofits. And so, you know, fast forward, and that's flourishing. That whole ecosystem is flourishing. And so my thinking about this is, in retrospect, is no one really, that's not the only way to do things. And it just happened because it was easy and fast and good. You know, a lot of good things resulted from it. I'm not disparaging, but it just wasn't necessarily the best way in the long run. And what we didn't realize is we were creating the Achilles heel for the whole strategic effort, in that all the organizations that were initiated and started to grow and thrive were overdependent on funding from outside the country, which then created a very easy strategy for anyone who didn't like it. For example, governments in countries where there weren't long traditions of democratic civic engagement and thought that NGOs were pesky and unnecessary and getting in the way of and I'm saying this very neutral. I don't feel neutral about it, but it can be talked about it from a detached way too. Governments who thought they knew better what was in the best interest of the country in a very unitary kind of a way, top down. And these NGOs are pesky, we don't need them. So governments who thought that way had a very easy strategy available to them, and it was simply follow the money, which has intuitive common sense to most people. Yeah, money's power, and let's follow the money. And oh, it's all coming from the United States or from the UK or from the EU. What's their agenda? What are they trying to get us to do? And do we want it? And so that's just became such a rich strategy for governments that wanted to shut it down. And it was quite successful. China, extremely successful. Russia, quite successful. China, extremely successful. And then many other countries in the world that have also followed that model. So that's where this idea came from. It was in my own thinking as I was contemplating leaving PILnet about what do I really care about. Reflecting back on my own very exciting experience in founding and running PILnet, and all the impact that I felt connected to, and thinking like, oh, that could disappear tomorrow, because closing space for civil society was already starting to be an analytical frame that people were starting to use. And at that time, 2015 wasn't universally accepted as the framing, but I was thinking to myself, based on my own experiences running operations in Russia and China, this feels different to me. And so I started thinking like, well, what if it's successful? It was 2015. What if it's successful and there's no more civil society? And like, won't I feel really bad for all those years and efforts and all the friends I have that are spending their entire professional lives building things, and then it just disappears. And so that thinking led to me to think along the lines I've just laid out, and come to the conclusion, like, it's not the only way. So what are the other ways? And the other ways are, it's really just a matter of financial sustainability. How do people that want to devote their lives to engaging on human rights issue X or Y, whether it's LGBTQ or domestic violence or prisoners' rights or whatever it is, how do those people sustain themselves? It's sort of a financial question, really, ultimately. And there's so many ways. And that's when I started thinking about trends in social enterprise and crowdfunding and other opportunities that were emerging, even as cross-border grants were becoming more and more difficult, verging on impossible. So
and
that's,
do you see any of these that would apply in Russia? I mean, would some of your models work in Russia? What do you think?
They are working. They actually are working. Pre-war, they were working. They were already starting to work. Many local, especially locally based organizations were exploring these models. In fact, I was part of an EU project that, as a grant funded project, was trying to enable that, run by two organizations, SJI and PBUK organizations, you might know. So I was part of that experience, and they were doing it. But then, of course, the war happened. The war started, and that it became even more complicated to try to do that. So present day Russia, very, very challenging, but the foundation's still there. The foundation is there. And I actually think there's some other opportunities that are emerging for how what civil society in Russia and in other places might look like in the future. It's partly this question of financial sustainability, but I think it also starts to involve even bigger questions of how do we do human rights globally, and what does cross-border collaboration and solidarity look like? And I think that's really changing. Or the paradigms are shifting, I should say. Like, we should think about it differently, especially, I believe, human rights funders, those human rights funders who are still trying to provide the financing for developing human rights networks should start to think differently about it. Because if you want me to continue, this is a little bit digressing from your question, but historically, I mean, what I mean is in the last 30, 40 years of human rights funding, there's been this very sharp distinction between promoting the development of human rights activity inside of a country and outside the country, so diaspora politics. And my own belief is that there's a real paradigm shift that's happening that's not fully recognized yet consistently, because back in the pre-90s or during the 90s, there were some prominent diasporas. To take one example from outside Russia, Tiananmen Square, which is a very prominent one. There are Russian diaspora aspects to this too, but that's just a really stark example. After Tiananmen Square, all the democracy activists who fled and then reorganized outside of China. And that was a certain kind of diaspora human rights effort. And if you compare that to now Hong Kong, what's happening, totally different contexts for what exiles can do when they leave the country. And I think people are being slow to, and I guess to be really explicit, donors often have programs that support, that tackle issues of migration, but those are not human rights programs. They don't think of them as human rights programs. And they think of migration as an issue. They don't want to distinguish between different kinds of migrants. We're helping migrants generally. We're not helping human rights migrants or people of human rights backgrounds. And I think that's where there's a strategic gap, because the borders are not the same as they were 20 or 30 years ago. You can now, I work from Brooklyn, but I could easily be talking to you from Taipei right now, or anywhere else I choose to be, and so can anyone. We learned that during COVID, that it doesn't really matter where we are in the world, we can collaborate on this computer screen. And so that, plus other trends that have kind of reduced the importance of borders in many ways in our global economy, I think we need to take that into account when we think about human rights strategies, especially strategies for developing the field of human rights. And with Russia in particular, I think is a great example, because there are now Russians dispersed all over the world. I mean, they were always Russians dispersed over the world, but there's been this huge outflow And especially within the human rights community, there's been even more, proportionally even more of an outflow. And those people are everywhere, and they're in positions of influence, and there are resources where they are that they could try to deploy or network with and deploy. And that's could be really powerful. So if we think of Russian civil society as only being what's happening in Russia, and it's important to note that there is still Russian civil society, because a lot of people that don't follow it closely think that everyone just left. It's not true. Still Russians struggling and trying to do really important things inside Russia. But if we think of Russian civil society as just being people, Russians oriented towards Russia, they happen to be sitting somewhere else right now, but they're still Russian and they care about Russia. And if we think about it that way, I think there's like a world of possibility for strategies that could become effective for the long run. Short run, they're not going to change the current politics of Russia, but in the long run, there's a lot that can be done.
Well, that's a good note to end on, really. And you've really introduced us to a whole new way of thinking about human rights and human rights funding. And it's good to know that you're out there making progress on some of these, what seem to be intractable problems. Really appreciate that you took the time to share your thoughts and perspectives and bring us up to date on your activities. And so all the best from Rights in Russia. And we hope to see you again soon, Ed.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Mary, for the invitation, and for the thoughtful way in which you're posing your questions. It's really wonderful, and thank you for the opportunity simply to engage on this kind of thinking, which is feels really important. So I appreciate it.
It's very important, right? Particularly now in these crisis situations. We need to, yes. So really good to get your optimistic and hopeful hopeful view.
I'm glad you caught me on a good day.
Okay, that's good.
Bye, Mary.
Okay, take care. Bye-bye.